let's start with the first. What do I need to know about sexual abuse to protect my child? Well, the first two, you need to know about the prevalence and you need to know about the impact of that abuse, have been covered tonight. I'll repeat them because it's important. Many people associate the term sexual violence with abusive adult relationships. In actuality, though, over 2/3 of sexual assaults that are reported to law enforcement each year are perpetrated against children. There are many different studies that will give you different prevalence numbers, but by far the most well-accepted and a groundbreaking study was published by the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. It's called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. I see a number of you recognize that. It was groundbreaking, and it's since been replicated on over 450,000 people, squarely middle class. And the numbers are, what we found out from the ACE study was that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men have been sexually abused before they were 18 years old. These numbers are staggering, and they're really hard to believe. And it means that every person sitting in this room likely knows someone who has been or currently is a victim of child sexual abuse. Child sexual abuse is 59 times more common than pediatric cancer, 14 times more common than autism, and infinitely more likely than a terrorist attack. Yet we invest heavily in efforts to treat these disorders and diseases and to prevent terrorist attacks in our schools and in our schools, while our efforts to prevent child sexual abuse lag far behind. For the sake of tens of thousands of children who silently suffer sexual abuse each year, we must do better. Beyond the prevalence of child sexual abuse, what was so groundbreaking about the Adverse Childhood Experiences study was the impact we found out that abuse had on children for the rest of their lives. A child that is sexually abused just one time is at an increased risk for cancer, heart disease, liver disease, obesity, smoking, drugs and alcohol dependence, early sexual encounters, early pregnancies, STDs, depression, anxiety, domestic violence, job problems, relationship problems, the list goes on. The most shocking of this list was the fact that child sexual abuse could actually impact physical medical disorders like cancer and liver diseases had never been known before. So who are child molesters? It's easy to assume, given the heinous nature of child sexual abuse, that child molesters are creeps, they're perverts, they're monsters. But this image is incorrect, and it's unhelpful, because in fact, there is no prototype for a child molester. Beyond the molestation, people who molest children look and act like everybody else. In fact, they might be respected members of the community. This notion of stranger danger, or don't take candy from a stranger, is outdated and it's incorrect. The U.S. Department of Justice reports that 93% of all sexual abuse cases perpetrated against children are done by an individual that the child knows or trusts. A third of all those cases are perpetrated by older youth. Which children are sexually abused? Well, the fact is that any child can be sexually abused. But the research shows that certain children are at increased risk for sexual abuse. If a child is trusting, naive, passive, quiet, disabled, troubled, bullied, lonely, outcast, if his home or her home has lacked supervision, parental discord, if it's a single parent home. Foster children are 10 times more likely to be sexually abused. A child living with a step-parent is 20 times more likely to be sexually abused. And the poly-victimization research tells us that if a child has experienced physical aggression by a peer or by a parent, they are 6 times more likely to be sexually abused. So essentially, child molesters are really good at identifying the children with holes in their heart, and they're really good at swooping right in and felling them. Out in Minnesota, they have the National Child Protection Training Center, and thousands of law enforcement fly out there every year to get trained. And one of the courses that they have is to train them on internet safety. And so what they do is they set up fake profiles of children to see what will happen. And if you set up just the right profile, say you write, "My parents are divorced and I could really use a cigarette right about now," those children were contacted, well, they weren't real children, but those children were contacted almost immediately by hundreds of child molesters. In some cases, depending on the profile, even thousands. It's because of this, understanding which children are more at risk, that we have to pause for a moment. Because of who these children are, they're also less likely to be believed. If they're a troubled child who's already gotten into other difficulties at school, at camp, in the shul, people are less likely to believe them when they report the abuse. We need to understand how child molesters operate. It is an oft-cited myth that a child molester cannot control his abusive sexual behavior. If this were true, child molesters would offend whenever they felt a sexual urge in the presence of a child. They'd molest when they're walking down the street, they'd molest at the mall, and they'd molest on the bima in the middle of prayer services. But with rare exceptions, this doesn't happen. Because adults seeking to molest a child, like anyone seeking to commit a wrong or sinful act, prefers to do so in private, where there are fewer chances of being caught. The sexual abuse of a child has less to do with the setting, whether it's shul or school or home, than with an offender having a ready opportunity to abuse. We also need to recognize indicators of child sexual abuse. It's too complicated to go into here tonight, but if you check out Darkness to Light, it's a website, and really any other child abuse prevention website, you'll see a whole list of what those indicators are. So what should I do to protect my child from sexual abuse? Well, for starters, children are ill-equipped to protect themselves. So adults have to become educated, supervise, and take action if they suspect abuse. So educate. Educate yourself and educate your child. Again, if you want to get educated, I would again recommend Darkness to Light. They offer a $10 online training. That's nothing. And it's hours long, and it's very detailed, and it's very good. Everybody in this room can go online and get straight on. Critical to preventing child sexual abuse is educating children using anatomically correct terms about bodies, sex, and abuse. And if you want, I have a whole pile of books over there for those of you who would like to peruse them afterwards. Caregivers may be reluctant to address this topic because they feel it is inappropriate or they don't want to scare their child. But society is replete with messages about bodies and sex, and children will learn from other children's or just by living in this world. It's better to receive calm, informative, age-appropriate information from caregivers than it is from peers, media, or, God forbid, a child molester. At the heart of child sexual abuse is an exploitation of power. From the earliest age, children are taught to respect and obey their parents, kibud avaim, elders, ahadarta pnei zakein, and rabbis, mora rabach k'mora shemayim. And generally speaking, this is good. It's an important, beautiful wonderful message to instill in our children. But we must qualify these lessons. We must teach children that no one, not even a Torah scholar, a spiritual leader, or an elderly person, is above the law, criminal or halachic, that forbids harming a child or engaging in sexual abuse. We must teach children to respect their own and others' personal space. They should feel comfortable and entitled to politely demand respect for their own personal space, even or especially from adults. Children should be given express permission to disobey an adult if they are ordered to break the rules or to do something wrong. We need to model respect for children's boundaries so that children know that they are in charge of the physical affection they give and receive, and so we can normalize their right to decline that affection. So some examples of this might be, I would love to hug you right now. Would that be okay? Or, do you have any kisses to share with Zaidi? Or, I'm stopping to tickle you now because you asked me to. I'll start again as soon as you're ready. Imagine a shul kiddush, where some friendly man comes up to your child and starts tussling his hair. It's sweet, but your child is all squirmy and is trying to slip away. The natural reaction might be to say to your child, show some respect. Give a Shabbat Shalom. Give a handshake to Mr. Gold. But that's not really the right message. Imagine if instead you said, it doesn't look like my child enjoys that. Or, my child asked you to stop touching him right now. Please respect that. If you can say something like that and it's hard to do, you've sent a really important message to all the adults around. This is a child who's trained about boundaries and about his own personal space and will report it. And not only that, this is a kid who has parents who are going to stick up for him. And if an abuser is looking to molest a child, they might just pick an easier target. Tell children that if they get an uh-oh feeling, we don't say good or bad feeling. We don't talk about good or bad touch because sexual abuse can feel good. But if they get an uh-oh feeling, or if somebody tries to touch them in any of the ways that you'll teach them about, they should tell an adult that they trust, and they should keep telling them until they're believed. And you can help them come up with a list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people that they should tell if this were to happen to them. One young woman told me a story about how when she was in junior high school, she was taking a test. And as she was taking this test, all the other students finished and left the room. She was the last one there. And the rabbi came and stood behind her chair and looked over her shoulder, and she assumed he was just looking at her answers. And suddenly, he put his hands on her shoulder and he started to massage them. Then he took his hands and he started to stroke her ponytail. And she describes to me how she froze. She just couldn't move. She just couldn't think. She didn't finish the rest of that task, but she ran out of the room. And she went to the principal, and she told the principal, this rabbi just touched me. And the rabbi said, the rabbi principal said, well, that's not sexual abuse. There's nothing I can do. In fact, though, he did go to this rabbi and tell him what this student had said. Now, the principal should have done more, because this rabbi proceeded to touch other children in inappropriate ways. And this girl knows because they told her. But this rabbi never touched that student ever again. She protected herself by telling him. Be direct. When I say be direct, I mean don't be embarrassed to talk about child sexual abuse. And don't beat around the bush. If you can be direct, this will decrease the risk of your child being sexually abused. Be direct when you speak to schools or shuls or camps or yeshivot in Israel, as Rabbi Blau said. Ask them about their policies. Say straight out, what are your policies children have been trained to identify and report sexual abuse. If you have a babysitter coming over to watch your child, let the babysitter know that your child has received training in preventing sexual abuse, and will tell you if anything happens. Tell your babysitter, don't bathe my child, if, let's say, you don't want them to bathe your child. Make sure you say that, and explain why you don't want them to bathe the child. If you suspect that somebody might be sexually abusing a child, or if you think somebody's engaging in risky behavior or behavior that just makes you cringe, confront them about it directly. Saying to them, I'm worried because this looks like sexual abuse, or this looks like grooming behavior, or this is really not what you want to be doing. Say, I'm watching you, and other people are watching you. You better cut it out. There are a whole list of other things that you can do as well. But the point here is to be as direct as possible. Finally, insist on training and policies. Demand that your youth-serving organizations get on board with prevention. Insist on training. So Rabbi Blau mentioned the Yeshiva University course that's being offered. It's actually pretty wild. It's the first of its kind. It's being taught by Victor Beef, who is the world expert on this topic. And he's teaching it at Yeshiva University and gearing it specifically to rabbis. This course should be flooded with rabbis signed up. And you, everybody sitting in this room, can make that difference. You can ask your rabbi to enroll in this course. And then you can go one step further. Show your rabbi that it's a priority for your shul. And you can do that by paying for the course, by giving your rabbi time off from other duties to devote to this course. It's up to the congregations to tell their rabbis and their synagogues and their schools and their camps what's important to them. Insist on training for all teachers, all camp counselors, all youth group leaders. In one synagogue, a youth director told me that a youth group leader would have he was a youth group leader for the preschool kids, and he'd have them sit on his lap while he was reading a story. And he felt himself getting sexually aroused. And he told his school guidance counselor about this. Thank God he told somebody, because they were able to help him, they were able to take him out of that situation, and they were able to address it. But there should have been training on what to do, what not to do. What's a red flag? What should you do if you start to feel? Insist on policies. Child molesters do not end up in youth-serving organizations by accident. They work really hard to get there. And a youth-serving organization without a child protection policy in place is a safe haven for child molesters. In fact, faith-based youth-serving organizations are at greater risk than other youth-serving organizations. Research studies on over 20,000 survivors show that over 50% of those who were abused as children were abused in the name of religion, or they reported profound spiritual injuries. Child molesters who were rabbis or priests or other types of clergy, or child molesters who were the most involved in their faith-based congregations, they were just like any other child molester with one difference. They were the most dangerous. They were more likely to be violent. Their victims were the youngest, and they had more victims than others. So form a committee and ask that committee to seek expertise on how to develop child protection policies. Stay tuned. My guide will be published hopefully in the coming months, and I hope that that can be a resource to you as well. What should I do if a child discloses, or I suspect that a child has been sexually abused? Well, for starters, listen. It's really normal to feel panicked, or to feel rage towards the perpetrator, or even an urge to just ignore, if only for a moment, the horrific things that the child is telling you. But it's really important to stay calm and to allow the child to talk freely. Do not interrupt the child or ask the child to repeat what they've said. But at some point, you may need to clarify. There's this joke about a child who's in a doctor's waiting room with her parent. And she turns to her mom and she says, "Mom, what's sex?" And the entire waiting room freezes. And everybody's looking at this mom. What is she going to say? How is she going of a child saying, "My daddy put his thingy too far in my mouth, and it really hurt me." And everybody was really up in arms and ready to do the right thing. But when the teacher said, "What do you mean?" the child said, "My tooth was loose, but daddy pulled too hard with his finger." So we need to stay calm. Believe the child and tell him or her that you believe what he or she is telling you. Inevitably, whenever I talk about this topic, somebody asks me, "Don't children lie?" The question itself is somewhat telling and concerning. We don't ask this question for other crimes. You don't hear somebody say when a theft is reported or a murder is reported, "Do you think they're lying? Maybe it didn't really happen. Maybe they're trying to get back at that other person." But I think what's going on is that this reflects the discomfort we feel in accepting the fact that child sexual abuse happens in our communities, to children we love, by adults we know and respect. Interestingly, it also reveals our preference, given an excuse to do so, to support the accused and discount the child's allegation. In fact, though, research shows 99% of the time, the child is telling the truth and the adult is lying. Protect the child immediately from the suspected offender. Before you do anything else, before you even leave to report it, protect that child and don't give the offender or the suspected offender any further access to that child. And then, do not investigate. You're not trained to investigate a case of child sexual abuse. And not only that, your investigation might make things a lot worse. And that's what happened a lot in the 80s and the 90s when people talk about, "Oh, kids made things up," or "kids were susceptible to being fed ideas." It was because a lot of people didn't know what they were doing. Don't investigate a case of child sexual abuse. Leave that to the authorities. And you don't need to know if child sexual abuse has actually happened. All you need to know is that you have a reasonable suspicion that sexual abuse has happened. And if you have that suspicion, pick up your phone and call. Report the suspicion. And then leave it to the experts to determine if the abuse has actually happened. The only thing necessary for child sexual abuse to continue in our community is for those who know of its occurrence to remain silent. Because few perpetrators offend only once or against only one child. Men who molest girls average about 20 victims, and men who molest boys average 150 victims. Most children don't tell if they've been sexually abused, and they're not believed when they do tell. 40 years of research tells us that the majority of adults who have witnessed or been informed of child sexual abuse don't report the abuse. In a study of approximately 200 teachers, given a scenario where a child discloses that a family member sexually abused them, only 26% stated that they would report that abuse. And when the scenario was switched and it was a colleague who was sexually molesting the child, only 11% said that they would report that abuse. Most of the time, good people don't tell. In the case of Jerry Sandusky, 19 different adults knew, had clear knowledge that Jerry Sandusky was sexually molesting boys. And 3 actually saw it happen. They walked in on him while he was molesting the children. And they didn't report it. And people say, "Well, that's gotta be a crazy case. What an anomaly." But it's not. That's what happens. This is really unfortunate, especially because once a child molester is reported, once they are caught, research shows that they have relatively low rates of recidivism thereafter. This is contrary to what many people believe. But once they're arrested, once they're caught, once they're convicted, the recidivism rates go way down compared to other crimes. Generally, when people don't report abuse, it's not because of halacha. Rabbi Blau talked about how Shira is not really the issue. We know the poskim have come out and said, report the abuse, a child's life is in danger. But people are scared and there are a lot of other things that come to mind. It's not an easy task to report a spiritual leader, a colleague, a congregant, a friend, a family member. But if nothing is wrong, the Child Protection Agency will close the case. In fact, most cases are not even investigated. And 50% of identified cases of abuse in this country, identified, where there's a broken bone or there's a broken hymen, they're not ever investigated, they're screened out. Individuals who molest children betray the trust of the entire community. They need to face the consequences of their action and receive treatment to reduce their risk of reoffending. If you suspect child sexual abuse or grooming behavior, trust yourself and your instincts. Please report the abuse. The last question: what should I do if a child in my community has been sexually abused? I'll be around to give you more details later if you want, but the short answer is support the abuser. Come on, we need a little comic relief here. Support the survivor. And remember the statistics. It's not an issue of if. It's an issue of when a child in your community has been sexually abused. And just think about the fact that there are adults in your community who have likely been sexually abused. So what will you do to support them? It doesn't matter who the offender is. Remember that you weren't there and you don't actually know what happened. If you feel so strongly that an injustice is being done to the offender, so do something about that. It's admirable to be nuanced and measured in your response. You don't need to take an extreme response. You should support due process. It's a good thing. Protect the offender's privacy during an investigation. Maybe determine if there are ways to safely meet that offender's spiritual needs. But in the end of the day, don't let that overshadow the importance of supporting the victim. We are a godly